Welcome to another thrilling Fated Mates Werewolf Romance Audiobook. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating werewolf romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. A New Beginning. The tires of Sierra's old car crunched against the snow-covered path as it wound through the dense, towering pines. The world outside was a blur of white stark, endless stretch of frozen silence. Dusk had already settled, the first hints of twilight creeping into the sky, painting it in dusky shades of violet and indigo. The snowflakes danced in the air like little whispers, each one a cold promise, their delicate fall adding to the quiet of the forest. Up ahead, a shape appeared, a large rustic lodge emerging from the mist, its stone walls dark against the fading light. The warm glow from its windows flickered like a heartbeat, a gentle invitation to someone desperate for solace. Sierra exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding, watching the lodge grow closer, its beauty more real than anything she'd imagined. She pulled her car to a stop just outside the main entrance, the tires grinding to a halt in the thick, untouched snow. For the first time in months, her chest loosened. The heavy weight of her past seemed lighter, almost non-existent. She pushed open the door, the cold air biting at her skin as she stepped out, and closed it with a soft thud. The crunch of snow beneath her boots was the only sound as she dragged her suitcase toward the massive wooden door, her steps slowing as she took in the sight. A weathered sign above the entrance read Cedar Lodge, but it felt more like a haven, a sanctuary from the mess of the world outside. The stone pillars, the arched doorway, the inviting glow spilling from the windows, it felt like something out of a dream. Taking a deep breath, Sierra felt the crisp, fresh air fill her lungs. No more hustle, no more chaos. Just quiet, just peace. With one last glance at the fading twilight, she reached for the brass knocker, the cool metal sending a chill through her fingertips. As soon as she knocked, the door creaked open, and a rush of warmth greeted her. The lobby was even more charming than she'd imagined. High ceilings with exposed beams, dark wood floors that seemed to hum with history. A giant stone fireplace crackled softly to one side, the flames licking at the logs with hungry enthusiasm. The smell of wood and fresh pine filled the air, mixing with the soft scent of something sweet, cinnamon maybe, or baking bread. "Welcome," a voice called out from the corner. Sierra turned, meeting the gaze of a tall, middle-aged man standing behind the counter. His grin was easy and warm, as though he'd been expecting her. "You must be Sierra. We've been waiting for you." She nodded, forcing her lips into a smile. "I guess I'm hard to miss. I'm the new chef." His smile widened, and his eyes twinkled with the sort of knowing warmth you'd expect from someone who had seen many faces come and go in the remote quiet of this place. "Spiced tea, dear?" he offered, holding up a steaming mug. Sierra hesitated for only a moment before accepting. The warmth from the mug seeped into her hands as she took it, the cinnamon scent rising into the air and filling her senses. "Thank you," she said softly, grateful for the simple comfort. The man's eyes were kind, but something flickered in them, a hint of mystery she couldn't quite place. "No need to thank me, you're here to relax, to start fresh." He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping slightly. "But you'll find that Cedar Lodge has a way of offering more than just rest, if you let it." Sierra frowned, sensing a strange undercurrent in his tone. She didn't know if it was just the isolation of the place, the lonely stretch of wilderness outside, or something more, but there was an undeniable pull here. A sense that nothing was as simple as it seemed. But it didn't matter right now. What mattered was the break from her life, her past. Her fingers curled tighter around the warm mug. "It's perfect. Exactly what I needed." The man's smile grew, though his eyes never left hers. "I'm glad to hear it. The place has a way of changing people. For the better, I hope. This place, it has a life of its own." Sierra's gaze wandered to the fire crackling in the hearth, the shadows flickering like a dance of spirits. She felt his words weigh heavy in the air, but she shook it off. The chill of the evening outside was still fresh in her skin, and she had enough baggage without adding more to it. She took another sip of tea, the warmth settling into her chest. "This is just the beginning," she muttered to herself, the words a reminder more than a promise. Sierra was led to her room by the lodge's employee, the hallway lined with antique portraits and wooden furniture that seemed to have stories of their own. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet felt oddly grounding, as if she were walking through something that had withstood time itself. The walls were adorned with tapestries of muted greens and browns, weaving a picture of rustic elegance that was comforting, not cold. When she reached the door to her room, the man smiled and handed her the key. "You'll be very comfortable here," he said, as if he knew exactly what she needed without her saying a word. "Dinner will be ready soon, and if you need anything, just ask." She thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper, and stepped into her new room. The moment she shut the door behind her, a sense of relief washed over her. The room was cozy, bathed in soft, golden light from the vintage lamps on either side of the bed. It was exactly what she needed: neutral, calming, familiar, but there was something about the atmosphere of this place that made it feel less like a temporary escape and more like a beginning. She set her suitcase down, then moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to reveal a view of the snow-covered forest, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Her reflection stared back at her tired eyes, a weary soul, but the barest trace of hope beginning to shine through. This could work. She could make it work. The knot in her chest loosened just a little. She wasn't running away anymore, she was choosing to rebuild. As she turned away from the window, her gaze landed on the bed, the thick quilt folded neatly, the sheets pressed and perfect. For a moment, Sierra allowed herself to picture what could be next: a simple life, a quiet life, cooking, reading, enjoying the world outside without fear. But as she stood there, a small part of her, something buried deep, wondered if this place would heal her, or if it would force her to face things she'd been running from for too long. Taking another deep breath, Sierra pulled herself away from the window, turning toward the bed. She was here to move on. Whatever secrets the lodge had, she would deal with them later. For now, she needed to rest. But she knew deep down that Cedar Lodge had already started to change her, and the stories hidden within these walls had only just begun. The dining hall buzzed softly with the murmur of quiet conversations. Sierra sat at a corner table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup, the steam rising in slow curls. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth permeating the room, but something in the air still felt cold, like a whisper just out of reach, pulling her toward something unknown. She hadn't expected to feel this alone. She'd come for solace, but the lodge's ancient wooden walls seemed to close in on her in the silence, making the space feel more like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Her gaze wandered to the other guests, a mix of locals and quiet travelers, but nothing seemed to interest her, until he walked in. Derek. He filled the doorframe like a shadow, pulling the light from the room. Tall easily a few inches, over 6 feet, his presence was magnetic, as if the air itself thickened in his wake. Dark, unkempt hair framed his sharp, sculpted face, and his eyes, deep, intense, and pale blue, swept over the room with a casual dominance that seemed to unsettle everything in its path. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed in a line, and when his gaze found hers across the room, everything around them seemed to still. The air between them crackled with something far more dangerous than just an unspoken glance. Sierra's heart jumped into her throat, a brief flash of something primal flickering through her chest, something she couldn't name. Then the moment was gone, and the sounds of the room returned, but the lingering heat of his stare burned into her skin. Sierra quickly looked away, pretending to focus on her half-eaten plate of food. She didn't know why, but her pulse wouldn't settle. Her mind raced, running through 100 reasons why she shouldn't be reacting like this. She didn't even know him. But the connection was undeniable. She could feel it. The pull. The spark. "Derek's a quiet one," came a voice beside her, breaking her reverie. Sierra turned to find Miles, the man who had greeted her earlier. He was leaning against the table with a knowing look in his eyes. "You'll get used to him," he said, his voice a little too soft, a little too familiar. "Who?" Sierra's voice sounded strangled as she glanced in Derek's direction, but he was now seated at the far end of the room, talking to a group of guests in low tone. There was an air of command to him, the way they all looked at him, like he was more than just the owner of this place. "Mim," Miles hummed thoughtfully. "Derek, the owner. Doesn't talk much about himself. Doesn't need to. People listen when he speaks, you know. Always keeps to himself." He paused, his lips pulling into a thin, almost apologetic smile. The lodge has a way of keeping its secrets. Sierra nodded, but a chill shuddered down her spine. Her fingers tightened around her cup, the warmth suddenly feeling inadequate against the cool tension in the air. Secrets! Miles' smile was tight, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite place. "This place has a history." But he added, glancing toward Derek, "Don't ask too many questions. You'll see what I mean in time." Sierra opened her mouth to ask more, but the moment was broken by a loud howl that cut through the night. It was long, drawn out, and eerie, the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Miles didn't flinch. Instead, he picked up a napkin and began wiping his hands. "Wild wolves," he said casually, as though the sound were as mundane as the fire crackling nearby. "Don't let it bother you." But the way his voice faltered slightly told her that it wasn't just a casual remark. Before she could respond, the door to the dining hall creaked open again, and Derek stood there for a split second, his frame dark against the light from the hall. As if sensing the shift in the room, his gaze slid over to Sierra, a flicker of recognition crossing his features, before he turned and left just as abruptly. Sierra's breath caught, her heart thrumming loudly in her chest. She hadn't imagined it. She felt it again, the pulse between them, the unspoken tension. When she finally exhaled, her skin was tingling, the pulse in her throat erratic, and she had to force herself to look back down at her plate. She needed to calm down. Focus. But all she could think about was the way his eyes had locked onto hers, the way her entire body had reacted to him, like her senses had suddenly heightened. "See?" "Told you," Miles muttered, now turning to make his way back to the kitchen. Sierra didn't have the heart to ask more questions. Instead, she sat back in her chair, staring into the depths of her tea, her mind swirling. The howls still echoed faintly in the distance, and she wondered what they really meant. She didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. Derek's presence would become a constant in her days at the lodge, the kind of presence that was impossible to ignore, no matter how hard she tried. His quiet strength, his deep, magnetic silence pulled at her like a thread she couldn't untangle. He was a mystery wrapped in shadows, and somehow she knew she was being drawn into something she couldn't control. Whether she wanted to or not, Sierra was already in the grip of the lodge's strange, veiled mysteries. And Derek was at the center of it all. Sierra sat on the edge of the bed in her small guest room, the warmth of the fire from the hearth flickering against the stone wall. The room was quiet, too quiet. It felt like the kind of quiet that settled deep into your bones, heavy with the weight of untold stories and secrets that lingered in the corners of the room, waiting for someone to listen. Her hands rested on an old family recipe book, the leather cover soft from years of use, the edges of the pages yellowed and frayed. She traced the cursive script on the first page, her fingers gliding over the handwritten notes in the margins. The delicate ink seemed to pull at her, urging her to immerse herself in the warmth of the history it contained. Each recipe was more than just ingredients, it was a glimpse into a past that she barely remembered but still felt in her bones. The old recipes were her connection to a time before everything went wrong, before she left behind the chaos of her old life. Each page was like a whisper of the woman her mother had been, the traditions that had been passed down from generation to generation. The book was the one thing she had brought with her from home, the one piece of comfort she hadn't been able to let go of. But tonight, as she ran her fingers over the pages, something felt different. The air seemed to hum around her, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant voice, a haunting, mournful sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She paused, glancing up toward the window. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, but the night still felt alive, restless, as if something or someone was waiting in the shadows, watching. Sierra swallowed hard, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. It was nothing. She was imagining things, that's all. After all, it had been a long day, and she was far from the life she knew. Maybe it was just the isolation, the silence. The wind howled again, louder this time, almost echoing in the empty space of her room. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could swear she heard something else beneath the howl, a low growl, deep and guttural, like a warning. Her heart skipped, the book slipping slightly from her lap as her eyes darted toward the door. No, it was just the wind. She was letting her imagination run wild, the isolation of the lodge playing tricks on her mind. But still, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was different here. Something was stirring in the air, something she couldn't see but could feel in the pit of her stomach. And then there was Derek. Her thoughts shifted to him, unbidden. His eyes, the way they had looked at her across the room. The sharpness in his gaze, the intensity that had lingered long after he'd walked away. She'd never felt that kind of connection with anyone before. It wasn't just physical, it was as if he saw straight through her, as though he knew something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. What was it about him? What was it about the way he made her heart race with a glance and a brief touch of their eyes? Was it just the attraction, or was it something more? The pages of the recipe book fluttered in her hands, and she glanced down, focusing on the next recipe. But her mind wasn't on the instructions anymore. It was on him, on Derek. A shiver ran through her at the thought of his presence, his proximity, how his silence seemed to pull her in like a force she couldn't resist. He was so different from anyone she'd met before, and she didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him, as if her entire body was telling her to go toward him, to uncover the mystery that surrounded him. But then the logical part of her, the part that had kept her safe for years, snapped into focus. No, this was a new place, a fresh start. She didn't have room for distractions, especially not one like Derek. Her fingers clenched around the edges of the book, and she forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. "You're imagining things," she muttered under her breath, trying to calm the chaotic swirl of thoughts in her head. The wind outside was picking up again, but this time she was determined to ignore it. She turned her attention back to the pages, pushing aside the lingering feeling that there was something in the air tonight, something that had nothing to do with the howling wind. It was something deeper, something primal that made her pulse quicken and her body tense in a way she didn't understand. She tried to focus on the recipe in front of her, but it was hard to concentrate with the gnawing feeling in her gut. Every part of her was tuned into the strange energy surrounding the lodge, to the mysterious sounds echoing from outside. She closed the book with a snap, frustration bubbling inside her. She was tired, too tired to keep thinking about things she couldn't explain. Standing up, she paced toward the window and peered outside, her eyes scanning the dark forest, the shadows stretching long across the snow-covered ground. The wind howled again, but this time there was no growl beneath it, no eerie, animalistic sound, just the wind. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, trying to quiet the storm inside her, but nothing worked. There was something about this place, the lodge, the woods, Derek, that tugged at her, calling her in a way she couldn't resist. Something more than just the physical attraction that had flared between them. It felt like fate, like destiny pulling her closer. But she didn't want to believe that. She couldn't. As she turned away from the window, her heart still raced, her senses still heightened. Whatever was happening here, whatever was drawing her in, she couldn't deny the pull. And she wasn't sure if that scared her, or if it excited her. Either way, Sierra knew one thing: the secrets of Cedar Lodge were just beginning to unravel, and whether she was ready for it or not, she was already caught in its web. The cold air nipped at Sierra's skin as she stepped onto the balcony, the vast, untouched landscape unfolding before her. The lodge behind her, warm and inviting, seemed miles away in the crisp, silver light of the full moon. A perfect circle of pale, ghostly light hung in the sky, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered trees and the darkened woods beyond. The stillness of the night was intoxicating, and for a moment she forgot about the heavy weight of her thoughts. She just let herself breathe, feeling the solitude seep into her bones. The world around her was quiet, too quiet. Only the whisper of the wind stirred the trees, a soft rustling sound that brushed past her like the faintest of memories. Sierra closed her eyes, pulling in a deep breath of cold air, letting it fill her lungs before releasing it slowly. She was alone here, alone in this strange new world that had both unsettled and awakened something inside her. The howl of a wolf broke the stillness, low and haunting. The sound was distant at first, almost as if it were calling from the heart of the forest. Sierra's heart skipped a beat. The howl was primal, full of hunger and raw, untamed power. She could almost feel it in her chest, reverberating through her ribcage, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Another growl, closer this time. This one wasn't like the others. It wasn't a cry of nature. It was controlled, a warning, and it was coming from somewhere nearby. A shiver crawled up Sierra's spine, her instincts screaming at her to go inside, to lock the door and forget the night. But something about the sound kept her rooted to the spot. It called to her, pulling her in. It felt like she was hearing something she wasn't supposed to hear, something forbidden. Suddenly, from the shadows of the trees at the edge of the balcony, something moved. Her breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. Derek. Eric. He stood still for a moment, his silhouette outlined by the moonlight, his eyes glowing faintly in the night. The air between them thickened with an intensity that Sierra could feel deep inside her, even from this distance. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence, so magnetic, so overpowering, filled the space between them. Sierra's heart pounded in her chest, and before she could stop herself, she took a small, unsteady step forward. Her breath came faster as she watched him, her mind racing with confusion and desire. Then it happened. Derek's features began to shift slowly at first, then all at once. His jaw clenched, his body tensing as his bones groaned and popped, his limbs elongating and contorting with unnatural grace. His back arched, his posture shifting from human to something else, something ancient, something powerful. Sierra froze, her entire body locking in place as she stared, wide-eyed, her breath stuck in her throat. Before her eyes, Derek was no longer a man. He was something other, a creature of the night, wild and feral, with gleaming amber eyes and fur that glistened silver under the moon. The wolf that had growled moments ago was now standing in front of her, but this wasn't a simple wolf. No, this was something far more terrifying, far more beautiful. The way his body rippled with strength, the way his muscles bunched beneath the dark fur, it was overwhelming. And yet, it was impossible to look away. Sierra felt her pulse hammering in her ears as a wave of fear and awe washed over her. She should be running, should be terrified, but instead, she was rooted to the spot. The air between them pulsed with something thick and undeniable, something deep and ancient. Her heart raced as his gaze locked onto hers, his amber eyes glowing in the moonlight like molten gold. She could see the intelligence in his stare, the same piercing eyes that had held hers across the room only hours before. There was no mistaking it. This was him. Derek. But now he was something else. Something that defied all logic. The air around her seemed to crackle with raw energy, the night alive with magic and mystery. And Sierra had never felt more alive in her entire life. Sierra backed up, her knees weak, her hands trembling as she clutched the railing of the balcony. Her heart pounded, and her breath came in short, jagged bursts. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she struggled to process what she had just witnessed. She had seen a lot of things in her life, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her mind refused to make sense of it, but her body was on fire, vibrating with the aftermath of what had just happened. Derek. No, not just Derek, that the creature was Derek. A low growl echoed from the woods again, but this time it was distant. His transformation, his presence, still hung in the air like a heavy mist, and the thought of him in that form, wild, untamed, was enough to send shivers down her spine. It was beautiful and terrifying, like a storm you couldn't outrun. She curled her fingers into the wood of the railing, desperately trying to ground herself, trying to find her bearings. But nothing felt real. Not the cold air against her skin. Not the heavy thrum of her heartbeat. None of it. She'd seen him. She'd seen Derek change into something other. And it felt like the world around her had shifted in a way she couldn't control. Was it a dream? No, this wasn't a dream. She could still feel the intensity of his gaze, the power of his presence, the magnetic pull that made her heart ache and her body crave something she didn't understand. Her thoughts were a tangle of disbelief and yearning, a storm she couldn't quite weather. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But at the same time, she couldn't bring herself to look away from the darkness beyond the balcony. From him. The soft crunch of snow beneath boots broke through her thoughts, and Sierra whirled, her heart skipping at the sound of footsteps. Derek, no, the wolf was still out there. She could sense it, and it was not leaving. Her breath hitched as she glanced back toward the shadowed woods. The distant howl was fading, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Was he watching her? Was he waiting for her to come to him? Or was he simply waiting for the night to take its course? She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to feel. But she knew one thing for sure. Her life was never going to be the same again. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling soft, golden rays through the thick curtains of Sierra's room. She sat by the window, cradling a warm cup of tea between her hands, but the steam didn't warm her. Her thoughts were too heavy, too tangled in a mess of confusion and something darker, a pull she couldn't ignore. Outside, the snow blanketed the earth like a quiet promise, untouched, pristine. The world seemed frozen in place, locked in a delicate balance of calm and tension. But inside her, everything felt off. The transformation, the rawness of it, the savage power of Derek as he shifted in front of her, the way his body contorted and changed. The primal, animalistic force that had taken over him. She could still hear that deep, rumbling growl echoing in her chest, could still feel the weight of his gaze, the one that pierced her to her core, as though he could see into her very soul. It should have terrified her. It did terrify her. But there was something else, something she couldn't deny, a desire that burned too brightly to ignore. It wasn't just the beast that had mesmerized her. It was Derek. It was the way he moved, how he stood, how even in his wild, untamed form, he had a presence that made her want to be near him, even though every instinct told her to run. The pull, it was real. She could feel it. Every fiber of her body wanted to turn back toward the forest, to find him, to unravel whatever mysterious connection was building between them. But how could she? She wasn't ready for this. Her mind screamed at her to retreat, to protect herself. But the rest of her was already lost in him. She could feel the thread between them tightening, drawn by something beyond their control, something ancient and dangerous. It was more than just attraction. It was fate, something that had been set into motion the moment they'd crossed paths. She stared out at the untouched world outside her window, the quiet snow-covered trees looking serene, a stark contrast to the storm inside her. What was she doing? What was this? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. She didn't need to look up to know it was Derek. There was something about the way he moved, silent, controlled, that made him impossible to ignore. Sierra's breath caught in her throat, and she shifted her gaze to the window again, refusing to look away. She was afraid that if she did, she might find him standing right behind her, watching. Her pulse quickened at the thought. She wanted to feel the warmth of his presence again, but there was too much uncertainty, too much confusion. She couldn't trust her feelings. Not after what she'd witnessed. But the ache in her chest, the pull she couldn't ignore, told her it was already too late to turn back. Elsewhere in the lodge, Derek stood by the fireplace in the main room, the embers crackling softly as he stared into the flames. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his posture rigid, his body tense. The heat from the fire did nothing to ease the cold that had settled in his chest. The transformation, the disaster that had unfolded last night, he'd let his guard down. She had seen him. The thought of Sierra's face, the shock and fear in her eyes as she watched him shift, tore at him in ways he couldn't describe. He hadn't wanted her to see it, to witness the violence of the change. But it had been too late. She was already there, already exposed to the darker side of him, the side he'd spent his entire life hiding from everyone, including himself. His gaze hardened as the fire flickered in front of him. The flames danced like they had a life of their own, reminding him of the wild, untamed power that lived inside him, power he couldn't always control. And yet he hadn't wanted to hurt her. He never had. But what if he had? What if the next time the change wouldn't stop at a mere transformation? What if he lost control entirely? What if the wildness inside of him became too much for him to tame? His heart beat a little faster at the thought, the guilt of it weighing heavily on his soul. Derek's gaze shifted to the door at the end of the hall. He knew Sierra was on the other side of it. He could feel her presence, even from this distance. It was the same feeling he had the moment they met, the sense that something had shifted, something had connected them in ways he couldn't understand. But now, with the events of last night, he knew he had to keep his distance. She wasn't ready for him, for what he was, and she might never be. The thought twisted in his gut, a slow, painful ache that threatened to consume him. He'd never been afraid of his nature before, but he feared what it would do to her, how it would tear her apart the way it had torn through his own life. Stay away from her, he told himself. It was the only way to protect her. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her. Her wide eyes, filled with that mix of fear and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored what he felt. The pull, the connection. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to go to her, to feel her, to press his lips to her skin and kiss away the fear he'd put there. But he couldn't. Not after what he had shown her. He wasn't sure if she could ever look at him the same way again. With a frustrated sigh, Derek ran a hand through his dark hair, tugging at the strands roughly. This was the last thing he wanted. He hadn't asked for any of it, but the beast inside him, his wolf, wasn't something he could suppress forever. And the desire to keep her close, to claim her, was something that threatened to break through his every resolve. But he wasn't a fool. He knew the danger of what they both faced. She deserved more than this. Derek's eyes flickered to the door once more, the flame of his desire flickering just as fiercely. But would she ever be his? Or was he doomed to be nothing more than a shadow in her life, too dangerous to touch, too broken to keep? The air in the dining room was thick with tension. Sierra sat at one of the long, dark wooden tables, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her teacup. The lodge was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth, casting long shadows against the stone walls. It was early afternoon, but the grey light outside had already deepened, the storm clouds rolling in, making the room feel even smaller, more intimate. Her mind kept circling back to last night. The image of Derek's transformation was burned into her memory, as vivid as if it had happened mere seconds ago. She hadn't been able to shake the unsettling pull she felt toward him, nor the terror that had seized her when she saw the ferocity of his shift. And yet, despite it all, there was something magnetic about him. Even now, with the silence stretching between them, the space between them seemed charged, heavy with unspoken words. Sierra took a breath, the weight of it almost suffocating. This conversation was inevitable. They couldn't go on pretending like nothing had happened. She had to ask the questions that burned in her chest, the ones she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. "Derek," she started, her voice softer than she intended. She could feel him beside her before she even turned her head, the faintest presence that made the room feel smaller. He was leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. A line of tension ran through him, the barely controlled energy that had always been present, even in his silence. He glanced at her, his eyes flicking over her face before meeting her gaze fully. His lips parted, as if he was about to say something, then he closed them again, like he was debating whether he should even speak. Finally, he stepped into the room, the sound of his boots against the floor breaking the stillness. "You have questions," he said, his voice low and measured. Sierra's breath caught. "I don't know if I should ask them," she confessed, the weight of her uncertainty heavy on her tongue. Derek's gaze softened just slightly, though the intensity was still there. "You can ask me anything," he said quietly, though the words came with an edge of hesitation. His eyes moved to the space between them, where the distance felt like an insurmountable chasm, and she wondered if he, too, felt the tension. She let out a slow breath and finally spoke. "What happened last night? What are you?" The question hung in the air, trembling with both fear and curiosity. Derek flinched, the tightness in his jaw returning. For a moment, Sierra thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd close himself off, like he had the night before when he'd shifted and walked away without a word. But instead he stepped closer, and she felt the heat of his body, the strength in his presence. It was hard to ignore. She couldn't seem to focus on anything but the way his every movement seemed to make the room shrink, his aura pressing in on her, drawing her in like a magnet. "I'm not like other men," he said finally, his voice rough, as if the words cost him. "I'm a werewolf." Sierra's heart skipped. She hadn't expected him to confirm it, hadn't expected him to be so open. The words seemed almost surreal, like they belonged to a world she didn't belong to. But here he was, admitting it. His eyes, so intense, searched her face for a reaction. She could see the storm brewing inside him, the conflict, the regret. He didn't want to say this, she could tell. Sierra swallowed, her mind scrambling to catch up. A million thoughts crashed together. It was real. This wasn't some crazy dream. What she had seen, what she had felt, it was all real. But then, amidst the confusion, something else stirred inside her. She felt empathy. She wasn't sure where it was coming from, whether it was the sheer honesty in his voice or the guilt etched on his face, but it was there. She had expected fear, disgust, maybe even rejection. But instead, she found herself stepping closer, wanting to close the space between them. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the words trembling on her lips. "Why now?" He took a deep breath, his hands flexing at his sides. "Because you deserve the truth." His gaze was steady, but there was something raw in it, vulnerable. "I'm not like you. I can't be. But I don't want to keep lying to you. I don't want you to think you know me, when all you've seen is the surface." Sierra nodded slowly, her chest tightening. She could feel the truth in his words, feel the weight of them in her bones. She had known something was off, known he was hiding parts of himself from her. And now here he was, laying it all bare. But that still didn't make it easier. It didn't make her understand it, or him. "Why didn't you tell me last night?" she asked, her voice unsteady, the questions falling out of her without thinking. He winced, guilt flashing across his face. "I didn't want you to see that. To feel that," he said, his voice rough. "The wolf, he's not gentle. He doesn't care about anything but the hunt. The hunger. I didn't want you to be scared of me. I didn't want you to see what I really am." Her heart softened. His words, the way he spoke of his darker side, were almost too painful to hear. She could feel the regret swirling inside him, so strong it nearly knocked her breath away. But then there was something else in his eyes, something she couldn't ignore. A flicker of something real. Hope. Sierra closed her eyes, her mind whirling. The truth was too much to process. The idea of what he was, a creature that could transform into something monstrous, was terrifying. And yet there was something about the way he looked at her now, the way his eyes softened, almost pleading, as if he was waiting for her to see him. Not just the wolf, but the man beneath it. The real man, the one who'd been keeping his distance, not out of desire, but out of fear. Fear that she wouldn't accept him for what he was. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the pull she felt inside her. The desire that rose with every word he spoke, but she couldn't run from it anymore. From him. From them. "I'm not scared of you," she said, her voice steady now, though her heart hammered in her chest. She was telling him the truth. She wasn't scared. Not of him, not of what he was. "But I don't understand. I don't know if I'm ready for this." Derek's eyes darkened with something unreadable. Desire? Pain? A mixture of both. He didn't step back, didn't give her space. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. "I never asked you to be ready," he said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But I need you to know me, all of me. Because I can't let you go without you knowing the truth." The air between them shifted, thickening with the intensity of their shared silence. The pull between them had been there from the beginning. Neither of them could deny it any longer. And in that moment, Sierra knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going anywhere. Sierra's night had been plagued with restlessness. Every time she closed her eyes, the images came rushing back, the terrifying beauty of Derek's transformation, the way his body had shifted from human to something primal, something ancient. Her thoughts had spiraled in 1,000 directions, trying to make sense of it all, trying to put the pieces together, but nothing made sense. The more she thought about it, the more confusing it became. The fear, the attraction, the pull that seemed to guide her toward him, despite everything in her mind telling her to run. The moon had hung heavy in the sky when she'd finally given up on sleep, sitting by the window as the night bled into the early morning light. She'd stared at the trees beyond the lodge, the shadows deep and mysterious in the quiet. Her mind, still clouded, had sifted through the night's events like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going anywhere. She couldn't. The thought of leaving this place, of walking away from the one thing that had stirred something deep within her, felt wrong. So, she had made a decision. Packing her things felt strangely final, almost as if she were preparing herself for something she couldn't predict. Something that felt both dangerous and enticing. She moved quietly, methodically, folding clothes and storing them in her bag with a kind of resolution she hadn't expected to feel. She wasn't running. She wasn't going to run. The supernatural world she had stumbled into was terrifying. There was no denying that. But there was also something undeniable about it. About him. About Derek. She had seen a side of him that most people would never dream of, heard his secrets, touched the depth of his guilt, and felt the weight of his eyes on her. Her pulse quickened at the thought of him. She had no idea what she was doing, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking away from this without at least trying to understand it. To understand him. To understand them. With one last deep breath, Sierra zipped her bag and stood up. The decision had been made. Now it was time to face the unknown. The long dining table was crowded with the pack members, their chatter filling the room like the hum of 100 different conversations, each more layered than the last. As Sierra stepped into the room, she could feel the eyes on her, their gazes darting toward her with curiosity and wariness. The pack had noticed her. She could sense it in the air, the subtle shift in the atmosphere when she entered. The casual conversation slowed for a moment before resuming, but the glances, the lingering stares didn't stop. Some of them studied her with quiet interest, while others held her gaze with suspicion. A few, mostly the younger members, eyed her as though she were an outsider, a curiosity they couldn't quite figure out. Sierra swallowed hard and tried not to let the tension in the room get to her. She had made her decision, but that didn't mean it was going to be easy. The weight of their scrutiny pressed against her like an invisible hand, but she squared her shoulders and stepped forward, heading for an empty seat near the center of the table. The smell of freshly cooked food was intoxicating, rich, hearty, and comforting, and for a moment, it distracted her from the tension that coiled in the room. As she took a seat, the pack's conversation resumed, but it was evident that she was still the subject of whispered remarks. "Don't mind them," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Miles smiling at her, his easy warmth a stark contrast to the rest of the room. "They're just curious. Haven't had a new face in a while." Sierra nodded, grateful for the kindness. "I don't mind," she said, though her voice was quieter than she'd intended. She wasn't sure if she believed that, or if she was simply trying to convince herself. "Trust me, they'll warm up," Miles said, glancing around the table. "Just give it time." Sierra looked around again, her eyes lingering on the pack members who were still watching her closely. Some were older, their expressions hard and unreadable, while others seemed younger, playful, almost like they were looking for a reaction. She recognized a few of them from the lodge, their faces familiar but distant. Derek, though, was nowhere to be seen. His absence seemed almost palpable. She picked at her food, trying to ignore the subtle discomfort gnawing at her insides, but there was no denying that Derek's presence loomed over her, even in his silence. She hadn't seen him since their conversation earlier, and part of her wondered where he was. She wasn't sure if it was relief or disappointment that gnawed at her stomach. Either way, it didn't matter. "So, you're staying, huh?" Miles' voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him watching her with a teasing grin. "You must have a lot of courage to face all this." Sierra met his gaze, a small, unsure smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe I'm just curious." Miles chuckled, but there was an undercurrent of something else in his gaze, something that she couldn't quite read. "Curiosity's dangerous around here. Tell me about it," she muttered, glancing around at the pack again. Every member was a mystery in their own right. Each of them had a story they weren't willing to share. But they were watching her, each one evaluating, silently judging whether she belonged in their world. "I'm sure they'll get used to you," Miles said, leaning in slightly. "They'll test you first, though. Some of them won't be too kind about it." Sierra's stomach tightened at the implication. She could feel the wariness in the air, the sense that her presence here wasn't quite welcome yet. The pack's fragile equilibrium, as Miles had put it, was balancing on the edge of a knife. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be the one who tipped it over. But then her gaze landed on Derek, standing near the door, his tall frame framed by the light from the hallway. He was watching her, his eyes dark and unreadable, but she could feel the pull between them again, stronger this time, like gravity, drawing her in. She didn't know what to do with the ache in her chest, the part of her that longed to close the distance, to understand him better. She had spent too long trying to shut it all out, trying to deny the intensity of what was building between them. But right now, standing there in the shadows, Derek seemed as much a mystery as the rest of the pack, and he wasn't about to let her solve it any time soon. As she stared back at him, her breath caught, her pulse quickening. The connection between them was undeniable, but so was the danger. Her instincts told her to stay away, but her heart was already pulled toward him, caught in a web she wasn't sure how to escape, and she wasn't sure she even wanted to. Act 2. Culinary Bonding. The kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft, golden glow across the rustic stone walls, while the smell of simmering broth and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling in the way only comfort food could. The room was large but cozy, its wooden beams and worn countertops worn smooth from years of use. Copper pots and pans hung from the wall, and the wooden shelves were lined with herbs, spices, and a haphazard collection of cookbooks. Sierra stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with a rhythmic precision that came as naturally as breathing. The knife sliced through the carrots, onions, and celery with satisfying ease, each motion steady and sure. The cutting board was a mess of colors: bright orange, vibrant green, deep purple, and the hearty aroma of a meal in the making hung in the air like an invitation. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Derek. She could feel him before she saw him, his presence filling the room like an unspoken promise. His energy, ever potent and magnetic, seemed to pull at the very air around him. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low, laced with something she couldn't quite place: familiarity, or perhaps something more. She didn't turn to face him immediately, trying to ignore the flutter of anticipation that rippled through her chest. "I think I've got it," she said, her tone casual, though the heat of his proximity made her pulse quicken. "But you're welcome to lend a hand." His footsteps grew louder as he moved closer, and Sierra felt him standing beside her at the counter, his presence a quiet storm. She continued chopping, trying to keep her focus on the vegetables, on the task in front of her. But it was hard, so hard, when every nerve in her body seemed to come alive at the mere brush of his shoulder against hers as he reached for the knife. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same carrot, and the contact sent a jolt of heat up her arm, settling deep in her chest. She tried to ignore it, tried to push the overwhelming connection away, but it was impossible. "Sorry," he muttered, though he didn't move his hand away. Instead, he shifted slightly, as if in silent invitation to stand closer. The warmth of his body enveloped her, and for a second she couldn't breathe. The closeness was too much, too intense. "No need to apologize," she replied, her voice softer than she intended, and she forced herself to focus back on the food. But even as she spoke, she could feel the heat of his gaze on her, the weight of his attention wrapping around her like a physical thing. They worked in silence for a few moments, the only sound the rhythmic chop of the knife, the sizzle of the broth, and the occasional crackle from the fire. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. She could feel his presence beside her, could sense the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. There was an intimacy in the ordinary act of preparing a meal together, an intimacy she wasn't sure she was ready for. Derek broke the silence first, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. "I don't know why I didn't learn to cook. I should have. My mother, she could make anything. She taught me the basics, but I never had the patience for it." He paused, then added in a softer tone, "Maybe I wasn't meant for it." Sierra's hand stilled as she sliced another onion. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, her heart squeezing at the vulnerability in his words. She could see the weight of his past behind his eyes, the shadow of something long gone. A life that he couldn't quite shake. A part of him that he couldn't escape. "I know what you mean," she said quietly, her voice a little distant as her thoughts drifted to her own family. To her mother's kitchen, where laughter always filled the air, where she had learned how to create magic out of simple ingredients. "My mom used to teach me everything. Family recipes passed down through the generations. My father, he was never around, but the kitchen was always home. The place where things felt right." Derek nodded, his gaze softening as he stirred the pot in front of him, the wooden spoon moving with steady, practiced motions. There was a silence that settled between them, comfortable in its quiet understanding. They weren't saying everything, but they didn't need to. The words were there, buried in the weight of their shared silence. Sierra smiled to herself, the warmth of the kitchen and the act of cooking grounding her, making the tension in her chest feel a little less heavy. It wasn't just the food she was sharing with him. It was something deeper, a bond built out of shared stories and a trust that she hadn't realized was forming between them. "You know," Sierra said, breaking the silence with a teasing smile, "you could learn how to cook. I'm sure you have some patience hidden in there somewhere." She raised an eyebrow, the teasing light in her voice a subtle attempt to shift the mood. It was playful, but there was something deeper behind it, a quiet invitation to move past the barriers, to share something more than just a meal. Derek's lips twitched, the barest of smiles tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'll admit, I'm a bit stubborn, but for you I could be convinced." Her heart skipped. For a moment she almost forgot to breathe as his words, laced with a hint of something more, sunk into her. The promise of something unspoken was there, hanging in the air between them, thick and undeniable. "I'll hold you to that," she replied, her voice low, steady. And then, as if on cue, she shifted closer to him, their shoulders brushing, the warmth of his skin igniting a wave of heat that pooled in her stomach. It wasn't much, just a small movement, but it felt like a spark. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment the world outside the kitchen disappeared. There was only the steady rhythm of their shared work, the quiet hum of their connection, and the magnetic pull between them. The air around them felt charged now, heavy with the weight of their proximity. And as the meal slowly came together, Sierra realized something. This wasn't just about the food. It wasn't just about the meal. It was about the connection between them. The slow burn that had started in the kitchen, in the space between them, was only growing stronger. And she wasn't sure if she could resist it anymore. The kitchen was bathed in the soft, amber light of the setting sun, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The hearty scent of simmering broth still filled the air, a comforting presence that wrapped around Sierra like a familiar embrace. But something had shifted. The intimacy between her and Derek felt heavier now, charged with the unspoken truths hanging between them. As she stirred the pot, her thoughts kept straying back to the way their hands had brushed earlier. That spark, familiar yet foreign, had left her heart racing. She tried to push it aside, tried to focus on the task at hand, but there was no ignoring the pull between them. Not anymore. Derek moved around her with a quiet efficiency, gathering the ingredients he needed. But he wasn't just helping. His presence beside her, the subtle way his body leaned toward hers as he reached for a bowl or a spice jar, was enough to keep her senses on high alert. And then, without warning, he reached into a drawer, pulling out a well-worn recipe card, its edges frayed and stained with time. "Here," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "This is my mother's recipe. It's been passed down through generations." Sierra took the card from him, her fingers brushing his as she did. The touch was brief, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She opened the card carefully, as if the fragile paper might crumble in her hands. The words on it were written in elegant script, but the ink was faded, the letters slightly blurred with age. "It's a stew," Derek continued, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite place. "A dish that's always been part of the pack's traditions. My mother believed it held something more. A connection to the history of the pack." He paused, his gaze flicking to her, his eyes dark with a mixture of intensity and regret. "I've never really understood what it means, but I think it's time you knew." Sierra glanced up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see the weight in his eyes, the vulnerability he was allowing her to witness. The same vulnerability that had been there the night before, when he'd shared his truth with her. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see, the quiet pain of someone burdened by a legacy they couldn't escape. "I don't know if I believe in fate," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes I wonder if this dish is more than just food. If it's a sign of something we're meant to understand. Something I've been running from for too long." Sierra didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the words hang in the air, a quiet understanding settling between them. She placed the recipe card down carefully, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of his revelation. "Derek," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to share this with me." Her heart ached as she looked at him, seeing the turmoil in his eyes. She didn't know what he was trying to tell her, but she felt the storm raging inside him, the same storm that had been haunting him for years. But Derek shook his head, his expression resolute. "I want you to know. I want you to understand why I can't run away from this. Why I can't just walk away from what I am." Ciara's chest tightened, the pull between them stronger than ever. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. The simple touch was enough to stop him in his tracks. His eyes softened, the vulnerability in them raw and open. "You don't have to explain it all to me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here, Derek. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment there was a silence heavy with unspoken words. Derek didn't move, his hand resting in hers, their fingers tangled together as if they were the only two things that mattered in that moment. The world outside the kitchen seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in this intimate, quiet space. The way he was looking at her so deeply, so vulnerably, sent a shiver through her body. She could feel him, the fear, the guilt, the hope. It was all there, laid bare between them. And yet the connection they shared, the bond they were forming, felt even more powerful than the weight of the secrets they carried. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But I need you to know everything, even if it's hard to hear." Ciara nodded, the understanding between them growing stronger. She had never asked him to explain himself, never demanded that he explain the unexplainable. But as she looked at him now, as she felt the heat of his hand against hers, she realized that she didn't need words to understand him. She could feel it all in the silence. The way his heart beat beneath his chest, the way his breath faltered when he looked at her. She was here, standing beside him, just as she had promised. "Let's make the stew," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Let's see what it's meant to show us." Derek's eyes flickered with something close to relief, something she couldn't quite define. But whatever it was, it made him look at her with a tenderness that surprised her. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and together they moved in sync, the rhythm of their actions becoming an unspoken language between them. As they worked, as they chopped and stirred, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't gone. It would never fully vanish. But it was replaced by something else, a quiet understanding, a shared bond. The dish, simple yet profound, simmered on the stove as they moved around each other in a kind of dance, awkward at times, but always together. The subtle brushing of shoulders, the shared glances, the quiet exchanges of words, each gesture felt like a step forward, a step towards something neither of them fully understood, but both felt so deeply. And as they stirred the pot, their fingers brushed again slowly, deliberately sending a spark of connection between them that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the food that was simmering now, it was the heat between them, building slowly, growing with every touch, every moment they shared. For the first time, Ciara allowed herself to believe that whatever this was between them, might not be as terrifying as she had thought. It might just be what they both needed. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what they were meant to find. The night air outside was thick with the scent of pine, but inside the lodge was alive with the crackling warmth of the fire. Ciara stood by the hearth for a moment, the flickering light casting shadows across the room. She could hear Derek's movements behind her, quiet, almost too still, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Her heart was still racing from earlier, the lingering tension of their conversation, the words they hadn't yet shared, hanging between them like a storm on the horizon. But tonight she felt a restless need to know more. She couldn't keep pretending like the lodge, and the man who lived in it, didn't hold more secrets than she was prepared for. And what better way to uncover them than by exploring together? "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice quiet, but the thrill of the unknown was unmistakable in her tone. Derek's gaze locked with hers, and the flicker of something dark passed through his eyes. You want answers, don't you? Her lips parted, but she didn't speak for a moment. He had a point. She did want answers. Her curiosity about this place, about him, had only grown since the moment she'd arrived. But there was something else she wasn't prepared for: the undeniable connection between them. And it wasn't just the pull. It was the fact that, when she was around him, she felt seen. Like she was part of something bigger than herself. "I do," she admitted, her voice low, carrying an edge of vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. "Then come with me," Derek said, a small, enigmatic smile curving his lips. "The truth is hidden in places you wouldn't expect." With that, he turned and moved toward the hallway, and Sierra followed, her heart quickening with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Every step they took was a step into the unknown, and she felt the weight of it in her chest, the fluttering anticipation stirring in her stomach. They wandered down the dimly lit hallways, the old wooden floors creaking underfoot with every step. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors, their faces stern, their eyes watching her as they passed. Each one seemed to whisper secrets, but none of them gave anything away. Sierra's gaze darted to the doors that lined the corridor, each one leading to a room she'd never entered, each one locked in silence. Some of the rooms were dark, others filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets, abandoned to time. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and wood, like forgotten memories. "You don't really let people explore, do you?" she asked, her voice a little teasing, though she could feel the tension tightening between them. "Not often," Derek replied, his voice laced with an unreadable emotion. "There are parts of this place that are better left undisturbed. But tonight feels different." Sierra swallowed, her pulse picking up again. Different. She didn't know what he meant by that, but something in the air between them was shifting. They reached a narrow staircase, the wooden steps groaning under their weight as they ascended into the dim, musty attic. The flickering light from the staircase cast shadows on the walls, and Sierra's breath caught as they stepped into the space above. The attic was larger than she expected, its shelves stacked with old crates and boxes, relics of a time long gone. There were cobwebs in the corners, the dust thick in the air, and the faint smell of aged paper and leather filled her senses. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. "You really haven't been up here much, have you?" Sierra said, her voice soft, reverent as she took in the old trunks and boxes that filled the room. Derek was standing by the far wall, his back to her, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. His gaze shifted to her, his eyes dark in the shadows. "Not since I was a kid." Sierra's curiosity was piqued. A kid. The layers of Derek's past were beginning to peel back, and she was here for all of it. Her gaze landed on a large, dusty trunk in the far corner of the attic, its brass lock covered in rust, but still intact. She approached it slowly, drawn to it like a magnet. As her fingers brushed against the cool surface of the trunk, a shiver ran through her. It felt important. Without thinking, she crouched down and brushed the dust off the lock, examining it. A strange, inexplicable pull tugged at her chest as she fumbled with the rusty mechanism, the old brass giving way after a few tries. The lid creaked open with a groan, and a cloud of dust puffed out into the air, making her cough. Inside, stacked neatly, were old books, their leather covers cracked with age. One in particular stood out. It was a thick journal, bound in dark leather, the pages yellowed with time. The sight of it sent a strange flutter through her chest. It didn't feel like just a journal. It felt like a key to something far larger than herself. Sierra lifted it carefully, brushing away the dust that clung to it, and opened the first page. Her eyes skimmed the faded ink, the handwriting elegant but hurried in some places, as if the person who had written it had been in a rush. "What is this?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Derek stepped closer, his presence behind her like a shadow, but this time she didn't step away. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, drawn by the quiet intensity he exuded. He didn't speak at first, his eyes scanning the journal as if they held the secrets to the pack's entire history. "It's a record," Derek said finally, his voice rough. of the pack's past, a history no one's spoken of in years. Sierra felt the weight of his words, the gravity of what they were uncovering. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols, references to old curses and battles fought in shadows. The deeper she read, the more she realized just how far the pack's legacy stretched. It wasn't just about werewolves, it was about power, control, and betrayal. "There's more to this," she said quietly, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't just reading about a pack anymore, she was reading about Derek's family, his history, his legacy. And it was all right here, in this dusty journal, waiting to be uncovered. Derek's breath was close behind her, his chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. She could feel his body heat just inches away from hers, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. The weight of the past settled over them both. The more they uncovered, the closer they got not just to the secrets of the pack, but to each other. The journal had opened the door to something neither of them could walk away from. "What does it mean?" Sierra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Derek didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward, his fingers brushing over hers as he gently closed the book. His touch lingered for a moment too long, a spark passing between them.